Welcome to Northwest Neighbors Village's virtual speaker series. We're delighted to bring interesting programming to our community. My name is Stephanie Chong. I'm the Executive Director at Northwest Neighbors Village. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a local organization that enables older adults to thrive as they age in our community by offering a robust network of resources and opportunities. With the assistance of a small professional team, our dedicated core of screened and trained volunteers play an important role in reducing social isolation among our older neighbors while assisting with practical tasks. We're committed to keeping our members engaged and connected by providing a rich offering of social, cultural, and wellness programming, which brings us to today's program. Due to the size of our attendance, all participants have been muted. Our presenter will take questions from the group at the end of the program. Please use the raise hand or chat feature if you have a question. This program is being recorded today and will be posted on our website for future viewing. I'd like to introduce you today to our presenter. Alison Gopnik is a professor of psychology, affiliate professor of philosophy, and member of the Berkeley Artificial Intelligence Research Group at the University of California at Berkeley, where she taught since 1988. She received her BA from McGill University and her PhD from Oxford University. She's a world leader in cognitive science, particularly the study of children's learning and development. She's the author of over 120 journal articles and several books, including the best-selling and critically acclaimed popular books, The Scientist in the Crib, The Philosophical Baby, What Children's Minds Tell Us About Love, Truth, and the Meaning of Life, and The Gardener and the Carpenter, What the New Science of Child Development Tells Us About the Relationship Between Parents and Children. She's a Guggenheim Fellow and Fellow of the Cognitive Science Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She writes the Mind and Matter Science column for the Wall Street Journal, and she has also written widely about cognitive science and psychology for the New York Times, The Atlantic, Science, and Slate, among others. She has frequently appeared on TV and radio, including The Charlie Rose Show, The Colbert Report, Radio Lab, and The Ezra Klein Show. Her TED Talk has been seen over 4 million times. She has 3 sons and 3 grandchildren and lives in Berkeley, California with her husband. Welcome, Dr. Gopnik.
Great, I'm so glad to talk to everyone. As some people may know, my connection here is my sister, Morgan Gopnik, and Morgan and I and my other sister, Hillary Gopnik, all became grandparents at about the same time. So we have a deep personal as well as scientific interest in being a grandparent. But it turns out that this interest comes from more than just the personal interest of having grandchildren. It's actually turned out to be something that's very interesting from the perspective of evolution and evolutionary biology. And in fact, I just edited just this week, a new issue came out of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. That's the oldest academic journal in publication. It's where Newton published. And they just came out with an issue about this question of what biologists call life history. So life history is the way that an animal or an organism develops. So it includes things like how long a childhood does the animal have? How does it bear its young? How often does it have babies? Who takes care of the babies? How long does it live overall? Those are all features of the life history of an animal. And one of the interesting things that evolutionary biologists have found is that life histories vary a lot. So you probably know, your cat or your dog has kittens, and then a very short while afterwards, the kittens grow up and they're completely independent. A fish lays eggs and then doesn't do anything else to take care of the eggs. But other animals, birds and mammals, for example, spend much more time and energy taking care of their young, and their young are immature for a longer period. Same way with overall lifespan. Overall lifespan varies a lot from animal to animal. And as we'll see, it can even change very quickly in the course of evolution. So there's this question about where do these life history changes come from and what do they do? And a lot of biologists suggest that very often the way that natural selection works is by selecting things about life history, about this developmental program, instead of necessarily, say, selecting for a particular outcome. So instead of picking the genes that, you know, make you have a particular length of neck, instead what evolution seems to do is
I can't get into this darn Zoom thing.
Oh, hold on, everybody. Excuse me. I'm so sorry.
I can see all the people, they're talking.
If you have a question, if you can just go ahead and ask the question via chat, and I'm happy to help you that way. Okay, Allison, I just have to unmute you. Allison, you're
I'm
muted.
mute, and that isn't helping.
Okay, there we go. There we go. Sorry about that, Allison. Anybody?
Are we okay?
I
Pardon?
think so. We're good.
Yeah. It's okay. We can all hear you well, or some of us can hear you well.
Yes, but I can't hear them.
Then you need to turn on, you need to connect to the audio, which might be like a box, a green
Oh,
box or something.
and it says share screen.
No, it's next to that. It's kind of like that, but in a green and a different color.
Wait, oh, here it is. Here someone is answering me. Click on the mute button on the bottom left. Well,
That's
Okay, you're muted.
That's okay.
You can.
This will also be recorded and can be listened to at a later date. I don't want to hold this up or hold Allison up from her presentation. There is a chat feature on the bottom, and we'll help you walk through that as well.
Okay, so yeah, so often evolution is selecting on this general developmental history rather than selecting for particular traits. So as we'll see in a minute, animals often are similar in a lot of ways, but differ in the way that their developmental history, their life history plays out. And this idea of life history is especially interesting for us humans because we know that one of the things that happened in human evolution in particular was that there were pretty drastic changes in our life history. So this, for example, this is a chimp in the Gombe. And by the time chimps are 7 years old, they're actually producing as much food as they're consuming. So they're self-sufficient by the time they're 7. And if you look even in human forager cultures, if you look even in human forager cultures, like hunter-gatherer cultures, you'll see that in those cultures, I've got the right presentation here. You'll see that in those cultures, children aren't independent, aren't producing as much food as they're consuming until they're 15. And my son is 30, and even when they're 30, among human children, we're still writing mortgage down payments and tuition checks. So our children are dependent, they're helpless, they rely on us for much longer than the children of our closest primate relatives. And then on top of that, we have what are called shorter interbirth intervals, which means that chimps only give birth about once every 5 years, and humans, again, even in hunter-gatherer or forager cultures, give birth about once every 2 years. So we stack up even more of these really helpless babies. So there's this puzzle about why is this? Why do we see this relationship between, why do we see this very long and what appears to be very costly early period of childhood in human beings? And one of the ideas, and as we'll see in a moment, the other part of our life history that's really distinctive, so we developed this very long childhood, but we also developed this much longer old age. So you probably know life expectancies have gone up, but if you look again in forager cultures, by the way, people used to call these cultures hunter-gatherer cultures and say that we grew up in hunter-gatherer cultures. Now anthropologists tend to say forager cultures. And the reason is it turns out that hunting doesn't actually produce very many calories. So it's a bit of a puzzle actually now about why it is that the guys go off and And hunt in these cultures, as we'll see in a minute, it's actually the grandmothers who are digging up roots in the back who are producing most of the calories. So now we tend to use the word forager to express the fact that it's actually the work that the women, and especially the older women, are doing, that is bringing in the food that, that the community or the village is going to need. So anyway, even in forager cultures, the reason why life expectancy is low is because many people die when their children or babies are very young. But if you survive to be 30 in these cultures, you're very likely to live into at least your 50s and 60s and even 70s and 80s. And again, that contrasts pretty dramatically with chimpanzees. So by the time chimpanzees are 50, they're very likely to die. They very rarely live past about 50. And they almost never live past their fertility. So there's no female chimpanzee equivalent of menopause. In fact, human beings are also very unusual in that we have menopause, that we live for 20 years after we're no longer reproducing for females. And again, even if you look in forager cultures, women are living into their 70s and 80s long after they've stopped actually producing babies. Now that's especially puzzling because there's only one other mammal that we know of among all the mammals that has menopause. And I'll get back to this in a minute, but that mammal is actually the orca, the killer whale. And that's one of the few examples we have of an animal that continues to live and can live for 20 years. Overall, the orcas are long-lived, but especially live past their reproductive age. So in this relatively short period, when we humans evolved from primates, from chimpanzees, we both developed a much longer period of childhood. And then we also developed this longer period, this kind of 50 to 70 period, this postmenopausal period of old age. And both of those really distinguish us from our closest primate relatives, make us very different from our closest primate relatives. And when you actually look in the fossil record, you can actually, I don't know how these anthropologists do this, archaeologists do this, but what you can do is actually look at teeth and bones and make inferences about the life history of our past ancestors. And we can even see this development taking place in the course, literally in the course of human evolution when we look at the fossil record. So that raises this puzzle. Why is this? Why do we see this relationship between this extended lifespan with long childhood, long old age, and other aspects of being human? Well, it turns out that if you look across a very wide range of different kinds of species, you see this relationship between how long a period of immaturity an animal has and how much investment there is in that animal from the adults, how much parenting there is in effect, and basically how smart the animal is, how large the animal's brain is, how flexible they are, particularly how good they are at learning about what's going on around them. And in fact, the first animals that where this was revealed were not even mammals, but birds. So if you compare our friend the domestic chicken, for example, chickens are very good at doing one or two things extremely well, like pecking for grain. When it comes to anything else, they're pretty much dumb and stump. They're not very good at learning to do new and different things. And chickens reach maturity in about 2 weeks. If you contrast that with, say, crows, corvids, who are very smart birds, this in particular is a New Caledonian crow, a bird that is as smart as many primates are, can use tools, can do all these amazing kinds of things. They're fledglings for as long as 2 years. So they're fledglings, they're dependent on being taken care of by other older birds for a much longer time than the chickens. And this other chart here looks at a whole bunch of different mammals, spider monkeys and different kinds of primates, and shows this same relationship between how long it takes for them to be weaned, how dependent they are, and their relative intelligence. So you see this very, very general relationship between how long this period of helpless childhood is and how basically how smart the adult, how smart and flexible the adult is. And there are a couple of things that we think are, in fact, you can see this even in marsupials, even in animals who are have a very different evolutionary history than we do. So these are the world's cutest animals, the quokka, who live on an island off of Australia. And quokka babies live in the mother's pouch for the first part of their lives. And you can compare, say, the quokka to the possum. So quokkas and possums are about the same size, but the quokkas only have one baby at a time, and a number of the elders, particularly the mother and the father, are involved in taking care of the baby, and the baby stays in the pouch for as long as a year. If you contrast that with the possum has a whole big litter of babies all at once. Only the biological mother takes care of the babies, and the babies are mature much more quickly. They're mature within a month or so. Now, I think often human moms sort of feel more like the possum in that picture than they do like the quokka family in that picture. We could all use more backlighting in our lives. But we're much more like the quokkas. And then when you look at the relative brain size, the quokka's brain is twice as big as the brain of the possums. So there's something about that brain size learning connected with having a long childhood with lots of grown-ups who are taking care of you. In fact, you can even see this in insects. So this is a study that I like, looking at cabbage white butterflies. And in this study, what they did was try to see which butterflies, how butterflies go out and forage for food. So if you know the story about the very hungry caterpillar, that's basically all you need to know about the life history of butterflies. So they find a nice green leaf, they eat a lot, the butterflies find a nice green leaf, they lay their eggs, the caterpillar is born, the caterpillar eats for several days, and then turns into a beautiful butterfly. But it turns out that even among these cabbage white butterflies, some butterflies just go to green food. That's all they do. They just know that you go to a green leaf and you lay your eggs. But other butterflies are just a little more intelligent. They can learn, for example, that maybe a red leaf is just as nutritious as a green leaf, so they'll actually lay their eggs on the red leaf. And it turns out that those butterflies that are smarter have fewer eggs, and the eggs take longer to mature. So this seems to be a very, very general biological principle that being intelligent, relying on learning, requires this longer childhood. And if you think about it for a minute, you can see why, and let me get back. This is a chart showing something that I was talking about before. Again, you can even see this in the course of human evolution itself. So this is some of this fossil evidence that shows that Homo sapiens compared to Neanderthals were actually maturing, the Neanderthals were actually maturing more quickly than the Homo sapiens babies were. So we see this in human evolution, even in the fossil record. Now, why is it that you would see this? Why would you see this relationship between having this long life history and being smart? Well, if you go back to those crows, there's actually some lovely work showing what is it that the crows are doing during that time. And what the crows are doing during that time is basically messing things up and fixing it and trying to figure out what's going on in the world. So for example, one of the things that these New Caledonian crows do that's so amazing is they make these digging tools. You can see that's a crow using the digging tool to get termites out of a log. So the way these digging tools work is that there's pandanus palm leaves, these long palm leaves. And what the crows do is they get the palm leaves and then they tear off the bottom leaves, so they leave little spikes, and then they use their beaks to sharpen the end to a sharp point. And then they find a log that has a hole in it that has termites in it. And then they take this tool, they stick it in the hole, and they pull it out, and they get kind of a termite shish kebab. The termites actually stick to the little barbs. That's a pretty amazingly intelligent, smart thing to do. And you can show that the crows actually have to learn it, because in that period of 2 years, the crows are basically trying and failing to do this. So the baby crows hold the stick by the wrong end. They put it with the barbs upside down instead of down. They stick it in a log that doesn't actually have any termites in it. They fail fast, as we say in Silicon Valley. So they keep trying to do these things. They keep failing. Then, of course, each time that they fail, they learn something about how the tool actually works. And importantly, in that 2 years, the parents are still around. They're still fledglings, and the babies are staying in the nest. And the parents are doing a couple of things that are really important. So one thing that they're doing is just continuing to feed the crows. But another thing that they're doing is actually leaving the sticks around for the crows to play with, and being tolerant of the crows' exploration. So there's something about the way that the caregivers are acting that's actually helping the crows to learn. And that long period, that 2 years, gives the crows the time that they need to be able to explore, to be curious, to try lots of things, and yet be safe and be fed and have termites to eat at the same time. Now, that's birds. Humans and a couple of other creatures have another advantage in that long period of childhood. And that advantage is that humans have culture. So when you look at human babies that are learning, not only are they learning the things that they need to do right away, but they're also learning from the traditions, from the ideas that have been passed down to them from previous generations. So for humans, one generation can discover something new about how the world works, and then we can pass that information on to the next generation. Now, this gets us back to the killer whales, to the orcas. There's very few animals that are capable of doing that, and they do it in a much less sophisticated way than humans do. Birds are one. So some of these intelligent birds pass on cultural information. But the animal that we know that is the closest to us in terms of passing on cultural traditions is actually the orca. It's actually the killer whale. And the people who pass on those traditions among the orcas are the grandmothers. Remember, I told you that the orcas actually are the only other mammal that we know that has this long period, this long 20 years of postmenopausal life. And it turns out that what happens is that those grandmothers actually literally lead the pod. They are there with their daughters and sons and their grandchildren. And when things get tough, especially when resources are rare, they actually will lead the pod to swim around and find the places that have food. So because the grandmothers have lived for so much longer, they've got all this information and knowledge about where resources are to be found, and they actually convey that information through to the next generation, of children. And to kind of have a bit of a spoiler alert, that seems to be even more the role of older people for humans. So we have a kind of model of it with the orcas, but that really seems to be the secret of what's happening with humans. Now you might ask, what is it that led to this change in humans? So why is it that we see this emergence of both a long childhood and a grandmother-grandfather period that seems so unusual and unlikely in human evolution? The best hypothesis is that it had to do with the fact that the environment got to be much less predictable. It got to be much more variable. Things changed more. You can see this is a chart that shows climate variation. So, now humans are causing climate change, but in the past, climate change actually caused humans. So we think that it was this variability, this unpredictability in the climate, that seems to have been the key to the development of our big brains and our capacities for learning and our capacities for culture, but also for our new life history with a long childhood and grandparents. And again, if you think about what you have to do in a world that isn't completely predictable, where things are changing, then that's a world in which having information across several generations is actually going to be particularly useful as you're trying to deal with an unpredictable environment. Now, it turns out that this ability to figure out the environment, as I mentioned before, is really expensive, not only expensive in the sense of tuition checks and mortgage payments, but it's literally expensive. During this early period, many new synaptic connections, many new connections between neurons are being formed. And if you look at children's brains, for example, in that early period between birth and 5, more new connections are being formed than they'll ever have before. And then as you get older, what happens is the connections that you use a lot become strengthened, and the ones that you don't use are pruned. They aren't there anymore. So you really have more than one brain. You have these two brains. You have an early brain that seems to be very flexible, very plastic, very well designed to learn things, to explore, to be creative. And then you have this later brain that is very good at doing things, very efficient, very effective, and not as good at changing. Now, an interesting question that we still don't really know is what happens as this process continues. But here's an interesting hint. If you look at this part of the brain, this green part, that's the prefrontal cortex. That's kind of like the executive office of the brain. That's where our capacities for things like focus and attention and long-term planning, where all those things are located. And that's actually the latest part of the brain to mature. And it may be that not having as much executive function, not being as focused on doing things at this moment or planning or accomplishing your goals actually helps you to be more creative in this early period. But the interesting thing is if you look further out, if you look towards the 50 to 70-year-old range, you start seeing this curve going back in the opposite direction. So that as you get older, you actually have less prefrontal control than you do when you're younger. And you might think of that as being a disadvantage. People sometimes act as if that's a disadvantage. You might not be as good at completely focusing on just one thing or completing a very complicated task. But if you think back to childhood, it also has advantages. And there's actually quite a bit of work that shows that having less of that narrow, focused planning control makes you think more broadly, makes you more creative, makes you able to have a wider focus. And it might very well be that it's part of the reason why typically people get happier after they're about 50 to 70 years old. So it may be that what seems to happen is that our brains have this early period for really designed for learning and plasticity, and then we have this later period that's designed for efficiency. And we may also have yet another period that I think is designed for teaching, actually designed for caring, nurturing, taking care of those young creatures and teaching. Now, I mentioned before that this is expensive. It's literally expensive in terms of the number of calories that it takes up. So if you look at this chart, this is a chart that shows the relative percentage of calories that your brain is using. So even right now while you're sitting here, 20% of your calories are going to your brain. So brains are like, like Macs. They're these very expensive computing gadgets. But the interesting thing is that when you were 5, over 60%, 66% of your calories were going to your brain. So my vision of this is, Atticus, who's my little 4-year-old grandson, is basically like a science fiction villain. He's this giant hungry brain that's perched on these little legs that goes around the world hypnotizing us all and turning us into his slaves so that we'll just feed his hungry brain more and more and more. And that's actually a pretty good description of what Atticus is like. So these little kids have these incredibly hungry brains. It's as if all they're about is feeding those brains and making those connections. And Kristen Hawkes, who's an anthropologist who has argued the most for the importance and significance of grandmothers, she has a whole idea of the grandmother hypothesis, has found that if you look at the newborns, if you look at the very young babies, what determines their calorie count, as you might expect, is how well fed their mother is. So if you're mostly a nursing infant in the first 2 years, then most of your calories are actually coming from your mother. But when you look at these 2 to 5-year-olds in forager cultures, the calories that are going to feed those hungry brains are actually coming from the grandmothers. So it's actually the grandmothers who are, going out, digging the taro roots in the back 40 and are actually providing the calories for those growing and active toddlers. So having the grandmothers, having that extra 50 to 70, that extra period, even though you're not reproducing directly, you're actually providing the food that's necessary to keep those kids alive during that period when they're having this explosive brain growth and learning so much about the world around them. So as a way of dealing with these hungry babies, we have hungry babies both literally and figuratively, babies that are hungry for food and hungry for knowledge. Human beings have also developed what I think of as the investment triple threat. So we have many more people taking care of babies than any of our closest primate relatives. So if you go back to that lovely 7-year-old chimpanzee, chimps are basically being taken care of almost always by their biological mothers for most of their lives. But if you look at humans, and again, you can even see this in the fossil record, we have this triple threat for taking care of these helpless babies. So one thing is that we have what biologists call pair bonding. Pair bonding means that fathers as well as mothers are taking care of babies, and fathers and mothers are attached to one another. They, love each other. They have something like marriage. Now, we sort of take it for granted that that's true, but that's actually a very unusual pattern. Only about 5% of mammals have pair bonding. Most mammals, and certainly all of our closest primate relatives, have something like a male who mates with many, many different females, or vice versa. They're polygynous. So pair bonding is actually pretty unusual. And this kind of paternal investment is unusual too. This is, by the way, is my son and my grandson. But again, if you look even in forager cultures, you see that fathers are showing this pair bonding, this attachment and love to their partners as well as their children, and they're involved in taking care of children. A second thing that we have is what biologists call alloparents. And this is a marvelous book that I highly recommend by the great anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy called Mothers and Others. And what she found is that, again, if you look at our closest primate relatives like the chimps, only the biological mothers are taking care of babies. But if you look at other kinds of primates like lemurs and langurs, you see that there's actually kind of a reciprocal childcare. So some mothers will take care of each other's babies. So some mothers will, if a lemur or a langur is out gathering food, then other adults in the group will take care of those babies. And they'll do that even though they're not kin, even though they're not directly related to the babies. And again, if you look at forager cultures, you see this kind of alloparenting. People who are not directly related to a baby will nevertheless be involved and engaged in taking care of babies. There's a lovely paper that just came out by an anthropologist, Barry Hewlett, and he looked at even who was nursing babies. And in these forager cultures, a baby will be nursed by, on average, 4 or 5 different people in the course of a week. So you just would sort of take for granted that if you saw a baby who was hungry and you were a breastfeeding mom, you just would feed that baby. There's a particularly interesting phenomenon that Hewlett talks about, which is you even see grandmothers nursing babies. So the grandmothers will be kind of like big pacifiers. If the baby's fussy, the grandmother will just put a baby on the breast. And since a lot of these grandmothers are still relatively young, you actually get this phenomenon called relactating, which is that sometimes the grandmothers actually end up producing milk just as a result of the stimulation from the baby being on the breast. I'm not sure that our grandmothers would go to those lengths to take care of our babies, but it gives you a sense of the fact that even something that seems as biologically connected to a particular mother as breastfeeding is actually something that in humans is getting shared across different different caregivers. And finally, now the pièce de résistance that you've all been waiting for, the last part of this triple threat is the grandmothers. So as I said before, we're the only species that has a long period post-menopause. And the grandmothers are actually the ones who are involved, grandmothers and grandfathers as well, are involved in taking care of the babies. If you look carefully at this picture of these three beautiful grandchildren, you can see that there's a grandmother lurking in the background. And grandmothers are not just, digging roots and making peanut butter sandwiches and keeping those kids alive. You can see in this book, this is actually grandma reading Now We Are Six, reading some of the poems from A.A. Milne in a very old copy, and 100-year-old copy of that book, and reading those poems, those 100-year-old poems to her grandchildren. Well, it turns out that isn't just something that contemporary, ambitious middle-aged grandparents do. in fact, if you look in forager cultures, what you see is a very interesting pattern. And again, in that special issue of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society that I mentioned, there's a beautiful paper. The papers there, by the way, are all freely accessible if you want to look at them. There's a beautiful paper by the anthropologist Michael Gervin. And Michael Gervin has done a lot of work looking at where culture comes from. How is it that we humans manage to pass on information from one generation to another? And what he's discovered is that it's actually the grandparents who are passing on the big important information about the culture to the grandchildren. So basically what happens is, this is a little oversimplified, but not too much. If you look at the 30 and 40-year-olds who are the ones who are being most productive, who are the ones that everybody has always paid the most attention to, they're out there busily, you know, doing the mating and the dominance hierarchy and bringing home the bacon or the resources or the taro roots, doing all the things that we do when we're 30 or 40. But it's actually the older people who have more knowledge and experience and who also aren't as directly productive, who are serving this niche of passing on information to the younger people. So I kind of like this. So what I say sometimes is, I think basically we're human up till puberty and after menopause. So it's when we're very young and when we're old, that's when we're doing all the really distinctively human things. That's when we learn, that's when we're creative, that's when we have culture, that's when we make up stories. And then the time in between, let's face it, we're basically glorified apes during that period. We're basically running around doing what all the other mammals do and fulfilling our biological destiny and predating and mating and fleeing and fighting and all the other things of midlife, of the prime of life. But the really human things, the learning, the stories, the understanding of the world, that's really happening. That's really happening earlier and later. And let me just mention one other anthropological study that I really love, that I think really encapsulates this idea about the grandparents as the focus of both nurture and care for the young, and also passing on culture. This is a study that was done of, again, one of these forager groups, the Hasda. And what the anthropologists did was to record the language that went on in this group at different times of the day. So just took, you know, here's 4 people together, what are they talking about? And just recorded it during the whole day. And what she found was that if you looked in the middle of the day, like at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, most of the people who were talking were the 30 and 40-year-olds. And most of what they were talking about was what she called CCC, which was complaint, criticism, and conflict. A little bit of what they were talking about was about cooperating and figuring out how they were going to do all the chores that they were going to do. But an awful lot of it was bitching and complaining about how difficult it was and how, you know, this person wasn't doing what they were supposed to be doing, and that other person was always causing trouble. I found this actually rather comforting. It's about 63% of the foragers' life is like, you know, life in a faculty meeting. So now when I come home from a faculty meeting, I say, oh, okay, that wasn't too bad. Like, it was only 63% of my day was spent in CCC. But at night, when the sun went down, there'd be a big fire. And then suddenly the participants in the conversation would switch. So instead of it being the 30 and 40-year-olds, now it was the children and the 50 and 70-year-olds. And that was when the children would gather around the fire and the grandparents would start telling the big stories about how the world worked, about what people did far away, or what people did long ago, or what the songs that were most important in the community were, what the mythological history of that community was. And I think that's a very vivid example of this point that that even though people in psychology have tended, not too surprisingly, to act like, you know, a 35-year-old psychologist is the acme of human achievement, actually these sort of much less neglected periods of life, much more vulnerable periods of life, early in life and late in life, those might actually really be the key to human success. So let me stop there and see if there are questions or discussion.
Alison, there are some questions in the chat, so I will read those to you. And they go earlier to your slides when you were referring to your graphs and so forth. One is, does the information we just heard about climate suggest that kids raised in the Midwest, where there's a wide range of temperatures, would have greater intelligence than in San Diego, for example?
It's funny because we were just talking about this in my lab meeting. It's a really interesting question about what children seem to need is this combination of a lot of stability, because they need to think that caregiving is predictable and that things are going to happen, and yet being in an environment that's dynamic. Our issues about trying to deal with the Zoom. Anyone who has a grandchild now has had the experience, as I have certainly had, of having your grandchild give you the Zoom tutorial. So my grandchildren are always explaining to me about how I can change the background and I can put cow icons on my screen and so forth. So it's this combination of having the stability of the caregiving content, but then also being able to deal with technological change. And the environmental variability was the thing that seems to have been the original trigger. But of course, once we had humans, because we have so much social and cultural variation, that meant that we imposed a lot of variability on the world. So even if you're not dealing with climate difference, the society or the culture that's around the corner or the next generation is always going to be a bit different from the one that you're in now. So that kind of variability, like what are the neighbors like? What's that next family like? That's actually probably a greater source of variability now than climate variability is.
Thank you. I have another question in the chat, and then Karen has her hand raised. The other question was with your graph earlier. Sally would like to know what the graph might look like with grandmothers. Excuse me, without grandmothers.
The one about the calories, you mean?
She's nodding her head, yes.
Yeah. Well, it looks as if the babies need that many calories. But what Kristen Hawkes found was that in these forager cultures, even just the baby's nutritional survival depended on the grandmothers. And there's quite a lot of evidence. In fact, it's kind of heartbreaking that one of the things that happens when you get nutritional stunting is that this brain development seizes up. So both being in situations where there's a lot of unpredictable stress and just not having enough food means that one of the first things that happens is that this brain development slows down. And there's even an idea that's out there that there's this kind of different life history strategy, sometimes called live fast, die young, that if you don't think that you're going to have this wide range of caregivers, you mature more quickly and put less work into having a brain that's actually going to enable you to learn. Just sort of have a strategy that says, okay, just try and do the minimum that you need to do to be able to survive, because you're not going to have the luxury of having a grandmama around who's feeding you and keeping you going. So both literally in terms of the amount of calories that the kids get, and also in terms of the signal that the kids get. Again, there's a really interesting paper in that life history issue by the woman who did the butterflies, that even just getting a signal when you're young that you're being loved and taken care of, something like, being held or being, having a sense that there are a lot of people around who love you, actually seems to improve your brain development, just that signal.
Okay, thank you. Karen has her hand raised, and Karen, I'll let you unmute yourself. Hold on, Karen, you're still muted.
Okay. Yeah, Alison, great talk. I'm curious, David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, has had several columns about the fact that we have too much focus on the nuclear family and that there should be more focus on the extended family, including grandparents and siblings, etc. And that seems to fit what you're saying. And I just wondered, what your thoughts are on this thesis.
I think that's absolutely true. And there's a lovely book called How to Live Forever by Mark Friedman. And he's someone who's actually been trying to institute policy changes, like having a grandmother corps where you could bring together. One of the things that's happened very recently is this strange thing where we have, you know, the elders are all off in Florida or in assisted living facilities, and the children are all off in childcare centers, and we're not actually bringing the generations together. And I think one of the things that's been very vivid with COVID is that those parents who were suddenly thinking, wait a minute, you can't really take care of children with just one person or even two people at home. You need this broader, you need a broader group of people taking care of children. Morgan can testify to the fact that she brought her children and grandchildren, all came down and moved into the house in DC with her as a way of dealing with it. And I think that's increasingly happening. I think people are increasingly recognizing that. But of course, the problem is we're a big, mobile, complicated society. So a lot of times people just aren't in the same place as their grandchildren. And I think part of the allo parent story is, are there ways, I mean, for instance, the idea behind the grandmother corps is, if we had universal childcare in California, how about if we had a position in every childcare that was just being the official grandmother or grandfather for that classroom? So you'd get paid, you know, as much as you do with Social Security or as much as you would at Walmart or Target. You wouldn't necessarily have to have a degree in early childhood education. You just be the grandmom who would be in that classroom and develop the close personal relationships you need to. And again, I think one of the things that COVID has made very vivid is that those caring relationships, caring for younger people, and also vice versa, caring for older people, which seem from an evolutionary point of view to be so crucial to human success, are ones that don't show up in the gross domestic product. They're ones that we don't pay very much attention to. We don't give those people very much money or very much status. And, you know, maybe the effect of COVID will make us realize, oh no, those are actually really the essential people. Those are the essential workers, and we'll start treating that work with the seriousness that it deserves.
Okay, thank you, Morgan. I have a question in the chat, and then, I'm sorry, I called you Morgan. Thank you, Allison. I have a question in the chat, and then Morgan's question is up next. The chat question is from Michael. He'd like to know, what is your thought on TV screens and movies, etc., replacing grandparents' story time chats around the fire in the evening?
Yeah, so, you know, I am much, and I think that the data supports this. There's a lot of worry about screens. That's kind of become a big source of, big focus of anxiety for elders thinking about kids in general. And I think the data and what I know about development, I'm much less worried about that than I am about other things, like the fact that, you know, 20% of children are growing up in poverty and isolation. Those are the things that are really damaging to children. When I wrote a piece about that story about the fire, you know, it occurred to me, well, actually, you know, in my house, we sit around this flickering screen thing in the evening and tell stories. And, you know, I'm not completely convinced that the children are suffering because Judy Garland is singing the songs instead of me singing the songs. It's probably a bit of an advantage. But of course, it's sitting together and talking and everyone being engaged in the story, even if the story is a story that's coming in, you know, even if the story is the Wizard of Oz on the screen. I think those activities are actually probably very similar to the ones we get sitting around the fire and telling stories. It is sort of amazing. Those of you who are grandparents, I think, will echo this. The grandchildren just love to listen to these stories about, and like the further back and the more gruesome, the better. So Georgie, who's the beautiful little blonde little girl in the middle of that picture, her favorite thing is to have my husband, who grew up on a ranch in New Mexico, tell stories about his grandma, Pearl, who, you know, went out and chopped wood and killed chickens and, you know, twisted their heads off and turned them into soup. Like, that's her favorite. Those are her favorite stories. And I do think it's striking how much grandchildren naturally seem to want these stories, and particularly stories about the distant past. I'll tell you what, there's no data for this, but I find this to be a very comforting, what they sometimes call an evolutionary just so story. If you think about being in that niche, if you think that your role is to get the wisdom of several generations back, which the younger people don't have, then it would kind of make sense that remembering things that happened yesterday is not something that's going to be terribly useful, because after all, the grandkids can remember what happened yesterday and the kids can remember what happened yesterday. Whereas remembering the things that happened 70 years ago really, really well, really clearly, or 50 years ago, like that's the thing that is really your cognitive superpower as a grandparent. So I find that at least comforting as an explanation for why the 50-year-old memories seem to be so much better than the yesterday memories.
Thank you. Okay, Morgan, I'm going to let you unmute yourself and ask your question. Is it working? Not working for me either. You want to put it in the chat? Oh, here you go. You're up.
It's a silly, facetious question. But looking at that chart of the calories, I'm assuming that in that important period from 0 to 5 when they need a lot of calories, if you can't find roots, cookies are good, right? Giving them a lot of cookies provides calories.
Well, I wasn't doing a good advertisement. I write a lot about this in my book, in The Gardener and the Carpenter. I have a whole 2 chapters about the evolution of childhood. And the example I give is like biscotti. And actually there's beautiful recent evidence, again, fossil evidence, that one of the things they found was these fossil traces of grinding up wheat. That was one of the things that humans, and particularly grandmothers, are doing in our human fossil evolution. It's one of the first signs of food preparation for humans. So that's like one step away from cookies, right? You know, it's basically taking the grains that are around and grinding them up and turning them into something that you would eat. And what else is a cookie but that? So biscotti, I think, especially.
Allison, we actually received a couple of emails in advance of your program with questions, and one was related to older grandchildren and grandchildren that are in their adult years, 30s, 20s, and trying to forge a relationship with them because they don't necessarily respond. Do you have any information on sort of those relationships as we get older?
Yeah, it's interesting. The truth is there's been so much less studied about how grandparents shape children and how those relationships work. We just don't even know very much really about how grandparents and young grandchildren are relating to one another. And we really don't know very much about how older and younger people are working when the grandchildren are growing up. But one thing that Gervin says, which is quite interesting, is he thinks there's evidence in the anthropological literature for what he calls alternate generations, which will speak to people here too. A friend of mine rather bitterly says, well, of course, the grandparents and the grandchildren are bonded because they have a common enemy, namely the parents. But Gervin finds that often you actually get closer ties between, even when the grandchildren are grown up in these forager societies, you actually get closer ties between the grandparents and the grandchildren than between either the grandparents and the children or the grandchildren and the parents. And sort of the idea is, if you think about different generations as enabling you to change what you do, then it kind of makes sense that there's a kind of intrinsic conflict between parents and children, and the grandparents and the grandchildren seem to be able to have a relationship that doesn't involve the same kinds of tensions and conflicts. And again, I think that kind of is an experience that a lot of grandparents actually would testify to. So I think that might be part of what's happening with adults. But again, I want to emphasize that, I think one of the things that we really need to do is, again, biological grandparents, they're scattered all over the face of the earth. They're in different places. We just have to face that. But I do think even independently of the biology, the idea of having relationships between older and younger people, including everybody at all, phases of life, and not isolating them, not keeping them separate from one another, that's something that we could really do a much, much better job of. And if we did, it would be, the Northwest Village is an example of this, that if we did, it would be much better for everybody, for older people and for younger people and for people in middle age.
Tom, did you have your hand up?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Alison, I'm Tom West. We had met for lunch years ago, you and Ali and I.
Oh, yeah. Hi.
That was the book In the Mind's Eye and others
Yeah.
about dyslexia. But one of the aspects that I looked into a little bit, but not nearly enough, and I'm very excited by what you have been talking about, is this whole idea of late maturation. And this seemed to be a pattern among some dyslexics where they can't do things for a long time, and then suddenly the development happens and they can do things much better than anyone else in a certain area. I'm thinking particularly of Martha Denkla. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, and certainly a Norman Geschwind and that kind of thing. But it's, you see these people more creative, more visual, more stories, and this late development pattern, which so sometimes if I feel bold, I'll say to my audience, the dyslexics are really just an extension of the human late maturation pattern, except we're more late than anybody else.
Well, I used to say sort of as a joke, but I don't think it is entirely a joke that, again, if you think about life history and natural selection, I think often these differences in developmental trajectory lead to variability in the way that grown-ups, in the way that adults are. And that's one of the reasons for having that childhood period, is that it enables you to introduce a lot of variability, a lot of difference, a lot of different maturational trajectories. And there is some evidence, for instance, that later frontal maturation is actually connected with higher IQ. So I think there is reason to believe, and I think that's again important because there's such a strong tendency in our culture to say, oh, okay, good, let's, get the kindergartners to be doing the same thing that the second graders are doing, and let's just get everybody to do it faster. Piaget, the great.
No, don't do that.
Yeah, exactly. The great developmental psychologist said, whenever he went to America, they had what he called la question américaine, and la question américaine was, well, how can we get them to do it faster? And I think there's very strong reason to believe that's really not a good idea. And often what you're seeing is this longer maturational period can have advantages that might not be obvious on the surface. And I think it's interesting to think about things like dyslexia. ADHD is another example of something that we treat as a disorder. And it looks as if part of it is just this kind of variation in how this developmental program unfolds, and also this idea that there are kind of trade-offs. There are things that you can do really well when you're a child, like this kind of exploration, and then there are things that you do better as an adult, like this kind of exploitation, and then there's also individual differences about sort of who's more childlike and who's more adult-like. Now, whenever I say this, like, my sympathies are obviously with these, crazy kids, but of course they couldn't make it till 6 unless there were actually functional grown-ups around who were doing all that hard focused work to be able to make those cookies. But I do think there's room for a lot of different possibilities, and there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs between them. I think it's not inconceivable, for instance, that people who become scientists, part of one of my slogans is, it's not that children are little scientists, it's that scientists are big children. And every time I've said that in a place like Fermilab or a place where there's a lot of scientists, they applaud and they nod their heads.
Oh yes,
they agree with that.
Yes. Yeah, it's with especially the most creative scientists are like that, not the memorizers.
Well, we're at the 2:00 hour. This was one of the fastest programs I have been to through Zoom because it was so interesting. I just want to see, does anybody have an additional question before we conclude today's meeting? Well, I can't thank you enough, Alison. This has been so helpful. I echo your sentiments regarding the importance of intergenerational relationships, and just know that anecdotally how important it is. I have put everybody I unmuted as many people as I could. If anybody just wants to say thank you for this program, this is your opportunity to clap or say thank you or what have you. This was
Well, thank
fantastic.
you all very much for hitting yet another Zoom, figuring out how to deal with Zoom fatigue. It's always great to talk to. It's great to talk to all of you.
Thank
Wonderful.
you. Enjoy your
Thank you all so much.
Yes, and
Thank
everyone
you.
go back and enjoy your grandkids. Even if my grandkids, I'm only seeing through Zoom or at the bottom of the stairs now, but that's an example where the technology actually really is a boon.
Oh.
Well, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.